It's a great pleasure to welcome Michelle to PRONI. I've known Michelle for a good while now. We've worked together. And I remember the first time she mentioned this project to me. She was telling me she was working on a project around archives and bogs. And I just found the most bizarre idea, because I was just like, archives and bogs together, you know. And I think what her body of work does is really interrogate what archives really mean, what archives should be about, and it expands the concept a little bit more. So it's fascinating, and I've seen some of the photographs before, and I think for PRONI is a great opportunity to be a bit more conceptual as well, and to think about their own archival practices as well. So it's great for us to be able to host it. So I'm Laura, and I'm part of a project called Making the Future, as you can see behind me. It's a Peace 4 funded project with 3 other partner institutions. So PRONI is one of them, Nerve Center is another one, Linnea Hall Library, and the National Museums and I are the 4th partner. And it's a 3-year project, so this is just, we're coming towards the end of our first year, so we still have 2 more years to go. The project has 9 different strands. It's a really big one in terms of numbers and in terms of activities. And PRONI is involved in 3 strands out of the 9 strands. And one of the strands is called Women in the Archives. So Making the Future, Women in the Archives. And that's what brings us here today to host an event like Michelle's exhibition launch. Women in the Archives is, as the name suggests, is interested in women in archives. But we're really interrogating not only how can we find women in the archives, but we're also interrogating archival practice in general. We're thinking about what we're leaving for posterity as well. How do we find women's records from the past, but also how will people in 100 years' time from now find stories about us? So Women in the Archives has this sort of like this twofold aim to both look at women's stories, but also to think about the future as well, hence the name of the project being Making the Future as well. So Michelle's exhibition fits very nicely within what Women in the Archives is trying to do, and this is actually the very first event of our Women in the Archives events program. We're going to be launching 2 exhibitions that are being created by one of our staff, Lindsay, who's just behind there, hiding. She has created an amazing exhibition called In Her Words, which is about diaries, letters, other written forms that women would have left, and Lindsay put it together into a very nice exhibition, and that's launching in next month in April, on the 11th. And we also have another exhibition in the Linnea Hall Library as well, document women's road towards citizenship as well. So that one is launching also in April on the 12th. And we have a program of events. As I said, this is the very first one. We have 2 more events happening this week, celebrating International Women's Day. So we have tomorrow a booked out women's tour of Belfast by bus with Lorraine Mills. And we also have, there is also a talk here in PRONI on Friday about Margaret Cousins as well. So these are the first 3 of many events that we're going to be doing throughout 2019. And for us, the biggest thing about Women in the Archives really is the community engagement program. So as well as this program of events, we're also running, we're working with groups and with individuals coming to our programs as well. And we are co-creating really interesting material as well, trying to uncover women's stories, but also, as I said, thinking about how we're preserving, how we're leaving stories for the future as well. So without further ado, please welcome Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle Moloney, and just to say, I'm going to talk a bit about archives, I'm going to talk a bit about bogs, and I'm going to talk a bit about how they came together to make this project. So you probably recognise from my accent that I'm not local, so I'm from Clonakilty. There are no bogs in Clonakilty, so I had no experience of bogs growing up. But when I was about, I think about 20, I moved to Bantry, and there were quite a few bogs in the area, and I was quite sort of taken by them, and sort of, it just was a different landscape for me, I suppose, so it really impressed me. And this is some of the landscape. This is around Glengarriff. And often I would say to people, oh, you know, what's up there? There was a particular sort of road, and they'd say, oh, there's nothing up there, it's only the bog. But somehow I saw something in it, some kind of, I think, forlorn beauty, and I was quite drawn to the spaces. And Many years later, I came across Seamus Heaney's poem, Boglands. And the first line of that poem is, "We have no prairies." And when I read that, I thought, that's it, this is my connection. And for those of you who are old enough, I associate prairies with cowboy films and wagon trains, and you're going into these scary places, and it's about adventure, but it's also about fear. And I think these are the sort of feelings I was associating with the bog. So many years later, fast forward many decades later, I ended up in Belfast, and I started doing some research around archives. And at the time, I was interested in community archives, but I really didn't know anything actually about archives at all. So it meant I had to sort of explore the theories around archives and also the philosophy. So I came up with two questions. What is an archive, and why do we have archives? So I really thought, well, the best thing to do is actually to maybe just look up in the dictionary, what does an archive mean? And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the archive, it's a collection of historical documents or records providing information about a place, an institution, or a group of people. And this seemed, you thought, yeah, well, that's okay, I kind of know that, but it seemed a little bit simplistic, maybe. So then I ventured into the work of Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, who wrote a book called Archive Fever. And he says the archive comes from the Greek archeon, initially a house, a domicile, an address, but most importantly, it was the residence of the superior magistrates, the archons, those who commanded. So Derrida establishes the archive as a place of power, controlled by the privileged and concerned with the needs of the powerful. So I'm just going to read a little bit of text I've written about this. It is from this place that histories have been constructed. Histories that stand as contextual evidence of the relationship between the archive and its creators, while at the same time being presented as a bastion of objectivity, neutrality, and truth. The archive is, in essence, a place of construction, where archives as records wield power over the shape and direction of identity and history. So as I was going through the literature, what was highlighted were some of the gaps and the absences. And basically, the poor were absent for the most part, women were absent for the most part, and indigenous people were absent for the most part. So again, I'm just going to read some text I had written about this. Archives have told a very specific story, the story of the powerful, the elite. However, what they have failed to tell is the story of the majority. This is evidenced by their absence. That is, of course, until they fell foul of the law, whereupon they were then recorded meticulously. Women are 50% of the population, and according to Dr. Bethany Hughes, they occupy about 0.5% of recorded history. So I think that's very much in keeping with the, I suppose, with the week and with Women's International Day coming up. So basically, male stories became the default and women's stories were the other. So it wasn't always like this. At the birth of civilized society, you had very highly productive and sophisticated settlements where women had great status. They were high priestesses, they had property rights, and they owned land. They wrote poetry. And so what happened basically was these communities wanted to expand, and in order to expand, they needed muscle power. And society became militarized, and what happened was the balance of power shifted. So indigenous people, the absence of indigenous histories in public history institutions such as archives, complete the erasure of indigenous peoples not carried out through the physical violence of settling. So in essence, the absence of the indigenous people was another killing. And somebody whose work I came across and like and really admire, and I was lucky enough to meet him in Belfast once, is a South African archivist and philosopher, and his name is Vern Harris. And Harris challenges the notion that the archival record reflects reality, accusing the South African apartheid government of censoring its opponents and destroying public and non-public records of dissent. He further identifies apartheid-era archivists as complicit in the creation of a socio-political narrative largely dominated by white men and institutions, a narrative that failed to reflect South African reality. Through appraisal, choosing which materials are valuable and deserving of inclusion in an archive, archivists in South Africa preserved the memory of the dominant socio-political order without painting a full picture of South Africa during the apartheid era. That has changed since and is in the process of changing, thankfully. But something as well Harris talks about, and I just wanted to draw your attention to it, is he says archives fundamentally offer researchers a sliver of a sliver of a sliver of reality. And so when one goes to look in archives, it's really important to think of it as it is information, but it is partial. Nobody has the whole story, basically. So what we've learned is that basically certain stories are privileged and others are marginalised. And when I was doing my research, I came across a lot of talk about democratisation of the archive. And my own research was entitled Reaching Out from the Archive. And what I'm aware of in PRONI, that they have several programmes going on over the years that are reaching out from the archive. And I think the Women in the Archive programme is also about reaching back into the archive. And I think this is kind of evidence that things are changing, which is quite a good thing. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the bog. As I say, I really liked bogs and I was very drawn to them, but I really kind of didn't know anything about bogs. So I came across a conference in Lough Neagh at Oxford Island, and the name of the conference was The Song of the Bog. And I just thought anybody who could think of that name for a conference had to have really interesting people there. So a lot of conferences I had gone to were very sort of one-dimensional. They were maybe about archives or they were about oral history. And that's very common, I think, in academia, where things are what they call siloed. But here I came across archaeologists, botanists, artists, environmentalists, people talking about bog bodies, and a first. One of the speakers wore a Speedo swimming trunks, which, as you know, are very small swimming trunks, and he had his body painted with butterflies. And he actually talked about butterflies. And that was, I suppose, in ways with the conference, it was just one of the most exciting places I'd ever been. So bogs have been part of the consciousness of this landscape for centuries. They have inspired poetry, provided a window on the past, a source of warmth, which is very contentious, I have to say now, the whole thing about peat and cutting peat, and a home to the richest of ecologies. Peat joins the built, the natural, and the cultural elements of our heritage like nothing else. So Professor Nancy Dye says, in terms of sitting there kind of quietly, year after year, packing away massive amounts of carbon, nothing tops these peatlands. And I'm now going to give you a statistic which I think will shock you, because it certainly shocked me. Peatlands store as much as 500 billion metric tons of carbon, or twice as much as is incorporated into all trees in all the world's forests. And that's from American Scientific, so it's a fairly, I think it's something you can rely on. The key is humidity. The water, that water is the key to the formation of the peat itself, which is the product of submerged plants that cannot be decomposed by microbes quickly. But once the water is drained away, the bugs that use oxygen have a party. They get carbon, oxygen, and a few nutrients, and they take the carbon that has been sitting there for hundreds and thousands of years, they metabolize it, and it's like eating ham sandwiches, it turns into CO2. Unfortunately, drained peatlands continue to decompose and emit carbon. So plants are another thing that are of great value, and this is an image of sphagnum moss, which was used for centuries for wounds. It has an antibacterial quality, so it was used extensively in the First World War. Bog bodies, you've probably heard of bog bodies. Again, they preserve the hair and the clothes because of the acidity of the peat, but the bones are dissolved. But again, there's like so much knowledge has been gained, and at this conference I went to, there was, I thought it was a good name, he was a Professor Ned Kelly, and he talked a lot about the bog bodies, and he's an Irish expert in bog bodies, so he was most entertaining and interesting. And also, of course, there was the preservation. You know, they found butter that is up to 2,000 years old. Sorry, no. One of my first trips was to a place called the Cage of Fields, which is over in County Mayo. And it's the most extensive Neolithic site in Ireland, and it contains the oldest known field system in the world. It's 5,500 years old. It's 2,000 years older than the pyramids. Now, I think that's another thing that really kind of jumped out at me. And basically what they found there when they, it was a guy, I think his name was Patrick Caulfield, he was a teacher. I think he was cutting turf or something, and he found stones, and he knew the way the stones were laid out, that somebody actually had put them purposefully that way. And so after a lot of research and, like huge funding, I have to say, was thrown at it, what they discovered was this field system. But they also discovered seeds and things that they had not known about. And I know one of his grandchildren grows barley, which actually comes from one of those seeds, which have been obviously dormant for such a long time. So I suppose for me, then I had all this knowledge about archives, and then I was gaining all this knowledge about plants, and all the time I was photographing bogs. And it just felt kind of intuitive, and I kept thinking there's something about transgenerational memory, and I just kept drawn to places. And I drove all over Ireland photographing bogs and fell into many bog holes as well, unfortunately. And what I noticed after a while was that I was photographing surfaces, and this made me think about archives. And I thought about, if we just accept what's presented, then we never really know the whole story, and it's so important to question and critically look and actually delve down into things. So for me, I thought, I had my aha moment. I thought, the bog is definitely a metaphor for the archive. And it does similar work. It's preserving, it's telling us about its past. What's different in a way, I suppose, is that it's not as mediated, one could say, in that whatever ends up in the bog ends up in the bog. Nobody is sort of choosing it, and then it's chance as well, whether it is revealed or not. So then I had all these photographs, and I thought, I had hundreds and hundreds of images, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I think in some ways I'm kind of like a closet archivist, in that I like organising things and putting things into categories. And so I started categorising things, and then I just ended up with loads of categories, and I thought, this isn't helping me at all. And one day I was listening to a piece of music, and it was by Miles Davis, and I just thought it was really beautiful, and I just looked him up and read a little bit about him, and he says, it's not the notes you play, it's the notes that you don't play. That's what's really important, that's what makes the music. So I thought, okay, well I'm going to, if it's good enough for Miles Davis, it's good enough for me. So I thought I'm going to adopt this attitude. And so I started really sort of getting rid of stuff and getting rid of stuff. And if you look at one of the main images outside, I thought what I really want around in this image is I want space to breathe. And I started thinking about it in terms of poetry, and I write a bit of poetry, and I was thinking what I wanted to do was that, okay, you can look at a couple of images that are actually, for example, around I photographed bog cotton, but I want you to be able to take a breath before you see the next thing. And so it's almost, in some ways, I'm trying to take you on a journey, but I'm also trying to take you, give you space to stop and breathe on that journey. So then I started thinking, I went to another conference then, I became like the groupie at the bog conferences. So I went to another conference on bogs, and it was in Queens. And this was a very different conference, and they had a lot of talk about, there were sort of archaeologists and scientists, and they had some microscopes. And so we were looking at stuff under microscopes, and I started thinking about that, and thinking about the tiny little piece of, dirt or bog or whatever it is they take to actually examine, to find out a story. And that then became quite interesting for me. So I decided I was going to photograph just a tiny little piece of dust from the bottom of a bag of peat. And basically I photographed it with a macro lens, and again I wanted a big space around it, so I set it on archival paper. And then I started thinking about, that has to be sort of the really biggest image in a way. So in ways I was inverting the images, so the sort of big images became small, and this one became sort of one of the main images. And as I'm a researcher, I write a lot and I take field notes a lot. And so I came and sort of looked back and looked at all my field notes, and again it felt like all those images, it became overwhelming. And I suppose I decided, well, I better do something with these, because there were a couple of things that sort of stood out for me. And so I just picked out sentences, and the 3 books were outside, and some of them just have a line on a page, but one of the important things for me was about choosing the paper. And so I choose a paper that you can just kind of see through, so it's almost like a palimpsest. It's like as if it's a document where other things have been written on before. So basically, in conclusion, I see the bog as a natural archive. It preserves, it holds stories, it tells us about who we were, which in turn tells us something about who we are now. It may also help us with our future in relation to climate change. And it holds layers of history embedded into the landscape. And I think I should give the last word to the poet, James Healy. We have no prairies. Thank you very much.